Greetings, friends of liberty. I have mentioned my meeting some years past with Admiral Edward Hughes, commander of the East Indies Squadron, whose carriage had broken down on the road from Chigwell to London. What I didn't mention was that, as he accompanied me, and we proceeded to the city, we discussed, among other topics, the continued enslavement in those regions of East Africa bordering the East Indies Station of vast numbers of white girls, they being kidnapped from countries further north, such as Greece, Circassia, and Slovenia, and then forced to work in brothels, their fair skin regarded as erotic. His sailors, sometimes taking to port in Zanzibar, and naturally desirous of relations with women after their many months at sea, they nonetheless, at times, felt unsettled in using the services of these unfortunates, sometimes treating them kindly in understanding their unfree state. All in all, Admiral Hughes's description portrayed a hellish circumstance with no ready solution other than the abolition of the slave trade itself, which I fear remains yet many years away. Now, if we turn to similar issues in your own 21st century in modern England, no less, we find to our astonishment not that prostitution still exists, which will occur so long as human beings still do, but instead that the existence of violent coercive brothels in which rape and trafficking are conducted sometimes on an industrial scale could continue. Such a truth, so unbelievable on its face, remains difficult to accept, and its causes even harder to comprehend. Our author, Peter McLoughlin, begins his book Easy Meat, Inside Britain's Grooming Gang Scandal, by reprising his title, the phrase coming in 2011 from former Home Secretary Jack Straw's description of how Muslim grooming gangs composed of Pakistanis, Somalis, Kurds, and others view their young female victims. As Straw elaborated, these young men are in a Western society. They're popping with testosterone. They want some outlet for that, but Pakistani heritage girls are off limits and they are expected to marry a Pakistani girl from Pakistan. So they then seek other avenues and they see these young women, white girls, who are vulnerable, some of them in care. Because they're vulnerable, they ply them with gifts, give them drugs, and then, of course, they're trapped. McLoughlin's was the first, and what may remain the only, book written for the general public on this issue. This fact in itself, as he says, speaking volumes of the extent to which the problem has been ignored. And in that neglect lie the symptoms which point to the deeper afflictions of British society. What was the extent of that neglect and indifference? Between 1988 and 2011, barely one media report per year in Britain concerning the activities of the grooming gangs was published. Now, one could think perhaps that there were so few reports because there was so little grooming taking place. The reality appears very different. As McLoughlin says, when we publicized the statistic of at least 10,000 victims earlier, we were mocked. But now senior police officers and members of parliament are indicating that the number of victims may be between scores of thousands and even as many as 1 million. And all that in the internet age, and where the power of the state doesn't hesitate to descend with all its force on parents when they merely slap their own misbehaving children. What strikes him as most important, perhaps about the whole issue sociologically, how afraid people are to mention the ethnicity or religion of the perpetrators. So, for example, a 2010 document by the Rotherham Safeguarding Children Board stated that great care will be taken in drafting this report to ensure that its findings embrace Rotherham's qualities of diversity. This, despite the fact that their own town council already 14 years earlier in 1996 had mentioned that most of the perpetrators were Pakistani Muslim men. Yes, so afraid are people that a House of Commons report made no direct acknowledgement that the gangs were overwhelmingly Muslim, with their victims overwhelmingly white. Or in yet another case, when a Dr. Jessen was ordered to remove all reference linking ethnicity in presenting her findings to the Birmingham City Council. Sometimes a variant of this evasion is to blame Asians instead of Muslims, forgetting, of course, that it was precisely Sikhs who were the first to actively fight grooming gangs, while Indians, Chinese, and Japanese are also generally entirely innocent. What's particularly ironic about this is that this procedure, silence, is exactly the same procedure used by the Muslim community to hide and shield their rapists. They hardly ever showing the willingness to confront or oppose them. Isn't it strange how not even one fatwa has been issued against the grooming of schoolgirls? As McLoughlin says, the collusion of the community is extensive. Taxi drivers, shop owners, and security guards who work in the shopping arcades where the girls are recruited are also involved. Or in another case, a Muslim woman receptionist who worked for the local government was jailed for having access to confidential database 60 times over 15 days to find details of the witness and her family. Now, the victims themselves and their families have naturally been more vocal about the crimes committed against them and their loved ones, but even these too, at times, ironically, have been threatened or bullied into silence or compliance by the gangs and their leaders. The tactics here employed have ranged from threats to disfigure faces, or one girl having her tongue nailed to a table, to the mention of the not uncharacteristic Muslim method of decapitation or throats slit, to imprisonment, as well as in other cases, arson. Incidentally, McLoughlin notes that a distinction should be made between generic sexual offenders, which can include all races and are primarily white in England, and grooming gangs, which are overwhelmingly Muslim, and thus not white. One database found 90% of entries consisting, for example, of names like Mohammed Rashid, Abid Sadiq, Shabir Ahmed, and Manwar Khan. And what's the typical attitude of some of these rapists? Here's an excerpt. "We are the supreme race, not these white biatches. You are a destroyer of Muslims. You were born 1,000 years too late. You effed my community. You destroyed my community and our children. None of us did that. White people trained those girls to be so much advanced in sex." Now, returning to the relative silence that envelops this whole phenomenon, it finally started to be broken to a degree when Andrew Norfolk, a journalist at the time, started investigating in 2010. Then he consistently could not get professionals in 21st century Britain to speak to him about probably the worst childcare scandal in the country in 40 years. However, after the publication of his investigation, he was then contacted by so many people who had refused to speak to me before. Again and again, McLoughlin notes failure to act by the authorities who had constant evidence of what was happening when it started with Sikh girls being groomed in Birmingham back in the 1980s. The Sikhs themselves, representing the strength of civil society, eventually fought back by engaging in vigilantism against gang leaders and by starting in 1998 the Sikh Awareness Society to warn others. And yet, the official inaction continued. One police report later noted by 2010 that thousands of such crimes were committed in the country of South Yorkshire each year. But the force didn't act in 2005, actually having shut down a special investigative unit. In yet another example, Andrew Norfolk in 2012 pointed out how strange it is that Bradford had not a single prosecution of a grooming gang, despite the city having a bigger problem than probably anywhere else in the country. In other cases, mothers of affected girls gathered evidence themselves, but the police threw it away. You wouldn't want Pakistanis to go to jail now, would you? That might cause a race riot. Unlike the British, the Dutch, who recognized the problem occurring, were working out ways to tackle it a decade before Britain would even publicly admit the problem existed. One of the ways was by making an instructional film called My Dangerous Lover Boy, which showed precisely how gangs lured girls in. A few UK schools showed it, but overall, the public schools failed here as well in their silence. As McLoughlin says, the film was never made compulsory for schools and was only ever shown in a handful of classrooms. He adds, there was also evidence that even when it was impossible for teachers to fail to notice that groomed schoolgirls had had prolonged absence or were disheveled in the classroom, teachers apparently did not act on the evidence in front of their eyes. So yet another institutional failure. The media, of course, aside from rare exceptions like Julie Bindel, Andrew Norfolk, and recently Alison Pearson, and some others, remained AWOL. As McLoughlin says, it is simply not credible that local news media did not hear of reports over a period of 20 years. Also AWOL were social services throughout the length and breadth of the country, with a typical mother, for example, saying, I wanted my daughters to be put into child protection, but they wouldn't do it. I must have called social services 8 or 9 times and phoned them lots of times. And of course, many governmental bureaucracies, like the Crown Protection Service, or Quangos, which are quasi-governmental charities, an example being the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Center, were also ineffective as well. In this last case, almost completely ignoring real-world neighborhood grooming while focusing on online grooming. And politicians, too, to round out this gallery of incompetence and rogues, were as expected largely ineffectual, with only a few like Labour's Anne Cryer and Sarah Champion having the courage to bring up the issue. McLoughlin finishes the book by including, among others, a number of interesting extended sections or points. One, on the history of Muslim sexual slavery, likely more prevalent than in any other historic civilization over the last 2 millennia, not at all surprising given that it's sanctioned by the Quran, or that a United Nations expert panel on slavery concluded that slavery is legal under Islamic law. Another section on Islamic anti-Semitism throughout Britain, which may be increasing as we see its expression almost every day in some form in England. Another on the Muslim treatment of women, which, as most people recognize, is often abominable. How the rise of the English Defence League and the British National Party motivated authorities politically to take these Muslim crimes more seriously. And a fascinating section on the intrepid crusading English Victorian journalist William F. Stead, who uncovered and successfully fought the grooming gangs of late 19th century London. Let me conclude by doing 2 things, giving this book a grade and giving my own understanding for why this happened and continues to happen. First, the grade. I would say A-, given how comprehensive, how objective, and even-keeled his tone is. Given his ability to focus on the relevant factors like multiculturalism and political correctness, Islam's relatively backward nature, and the evasion of so many influential societal actors and institutions. Incidentally, Amazon has bent the knee by not selling this book, either in the US or UK, but you can find it at other outlets in both countries. And you can hear Peter himself on YouTube being interviewed at length by Brian of London. Now, secondly, to the causes. I am, in some sense, a classically liberal systems guy, so explain things based on how the parts of a society are not functioning because not classically liberal. So let me do that here, listing a number of relevant factors. Number 1, immigration policy in classical liberalism is highly influenced by domestic policy. Milton Friedman, among others, talked about this. So if domestically you don't have a welfare state, immigration results will be better. But if you do have a welfare state, as we see presently in so many countries of Europe, like Germany and Sweden especially, if you do, immigrants can be often attracted to get the freebies for themselves and for all their dependents, and Muslims have many children. Secondly, in a welfare state, Muslims don't have to work as much, so they don't become as integrated by having to interact in a job. And thus, if they're old school from Pakistan, the women will stay at home, some of them producing more anti-Semitic Muslim babies. And the communities will more likely retain their relatively misogynistic Muslim values. You want to create anti-Semites? Get a welfare state, and B, import lots of fundamentalist Muslims. 2. These grooming gangs are often affiliated with and part of organized crime, which means that they love and are often financed by black markets, like that created by the drug war. Legalizing drugs would damage organized crime overall. It would just have less money to work with. Also, legalizing all prostitution would help, so all brothels could be openly inspected for whether they engage in sexual trafficking and the criminal retention of women against their will. Number 3. The educational system, being largely public in England, or if private subsidized by the state, is, for this reason, much more likely to be racist and bigoted in its totality, and thus to respond to and teach intellectual fads and garbage ideologies like multiculturalism, political correctness, alleged white privilege, and critical race theory. This exact problem has been shown time and again in the United States. Privatizing the educational system at all levels would be perhaps the greatest single blow one could strike at the proliferation of all these racist doctrines, which may be the greatest single cause enabling grooming gangs on a deeper societal level. Since private schools are not subsidized by the state, they would have to respond to and teach in their classes the more rational values of civil society, which most parents have and want taught. Number 4, morals legislation never works in any form. So in the U.S., the anti-discrimination aspects of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1991 have helped to create bureaucracies that enforce quotas and the protection of their designated minorities, which end up counterproductively making the society act in more, not less racist ways. So in the UK, it too started in the 70s, passing many different types of anti-discrimination laws, among which were the Equal Pay Act, 1970, the Sex Discrimination Act, 1975, the Race Relations Act, 1976, and the Disability Discrimination Act, 1995, all of which were superseded by the Equality Acts, 2010. So I will bet, just like the U.S. schools won't get their funding if they don't follow all these allegedly anti-discrimination statutes, which incentivizes them to be politically correct and teach political correctness. These acts, to the degree that they're enforced with significant penalties, are without question one of the forces creating the fear in the population that prevents them from calling out Muslims for their rape of schoolgirls. So in both the U.S. and Britain, we have A, public educational system with its racist ideologies justifying privileging minorities, and B, the respective anti-discrimination bureaucracies and statutes which contribute to the horrendous consequences we see here by incentivizing behavior excusing Muslim bad behavior. Number 5. Finally, other relevant factors are A, the protection of police and social service workers who never are fired or lose their jobs for their failure to do their legal duty. B, the many quangos, as mentioned previously, charitable organizations subsidized by government, which should have all their public funding eliminated. This would make them less politicized and more rational. And C, the behavior of the British judiciary, who give light sentences to devout Muslim men who rape underage girls, excusing the men's behavior if they had a very Islamic upbringing. So all these factors and more contributed and contribute towards creating this problem. Very happy for my part that all my male friends find nothing quite as attractive as a woman's consent. I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.